5 for section 3.3. So the graph shows the number of miles a helicopter is from its destination after X hours on its first flight. On its second flight, the helicopter travels 50 miles farther and increases its speed by 25 miles per hour. The function f of x equals 350 minus 125x represents the second flight, where f of x is the number of miles the helicopter is from its destination after x hours. Which flight takes less time explained. So what we're looking at here is we're comparing the same things. F of x is the number of miles the helicopter is from its destination after x hours. So we're comparing two things. Our x is the number of hours that we've been traveling. Our f of x, or our output, is the number of miles from our destination. So what we're going to do is compare information given us in two ways. The first flight versus this formula is for the second flight. So first, let's get our information from the first flight. You guys follow me with this? Let's get our information from the first flight. When we look at this graph, we've got our inputs and our outputs, our x's and our f of x's. So I'm just going to pick one point. If I look at that point, this point can be represented as f of 1 equals 200. So f of 1 equals 200. What that means is the number of miles from our destination after we've been traveling for 1 hour is 200 miles. In other words, we traveled for 1 hour, you traveled 200 miles. Okay? You're 200 miles from your destination. Let me make sure I say it that way. So if I look at this point, this would be f of 2 equals 100. In other words, the distance from our destination after 2 hours of travel is 100 miles. So we travel for 2 hours, we're 100 miles away from our destination. We want to know which flight takes less time. So there's a trick question you got to think here. How many miles away from my destination am I when I reach my destination? And it's kind of tricky, but it's 0. You're 0 miles from your destination when you reach your destination. So what I want to find is when f of x equals 0. This means when the distance from my destination is 0. Well, that's easy when I look on a graph. So this represents my miles from my destination. So this is where it's 0. I go over to this point. F of 3 equals 0. This point means after 3 hours of traveling, I'm 0 miles from my destination. In other words, it took me 3 hours on my first flight to reach my destination. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. To recap up till now, we looked at our two variables, the hours we've traveled and our distance from our destination. If we want to see how long our flight took, we simply need to know when we are 0 miles away from our destination. That's represented by this point because that's where our f of x is 0. When f of x is 0, x is 3. In other words, f of 3 is 0. So the first flight took 3 hours. We'll mark that. First flight took 3 hours. Now we have to find our second flight. Doesn't this hold true though? When f of x equals 0, that's when we reach our destination. So now we're just going to use this. We're going to use it with an equation. We're not going to read it on a graph. we're going to plug it into our equation. So all I have to do is say, okay, well, if f of x equals 0, I'm plugging that in for f of x. So I just have to solve the equation. 0 equals 350 minus 125x. So again, all I'm saying is I arrive at my destination when the distance from my destination is 0. That's when f of x is 0. So I put 0 equals 350 minus 125x. When I solve this, I will have solved for the number of hours it takes to travel on the second trip. So subtract 350 from each side. Negative 350 equals negative 125x. Divide each side by negative 125. Divide by negative 125. And I'm actually going to need a calculator for that because it doesn't go in perfect. So negative 350 divided by negative 125 is, actually, 2.33 repeating, or 2 1/3. So 2 1/3 equals x. The first flight took 3 hours. The second flight took 2 1/3 hours. So which flight takes less time? The second flight. Why? First flight took 3 hours. The second flight only took 2 1/3 hours. So again, as a final recap, they were asking us which flight took less time. In order to know that, you have to figure out, when do I arrive? You arrive when your distance is 0, or when your f of x is 0, because that's your miles from your destination. Looking on the graph, that's going to be down here at the x-intercept, at 3, 0, or f of 3 equals 0. At 3 hours, we're 0 hours from our destination. In the equation, you had to substitute f of x with 0, because that was our dependent variable, is what we wanted to know when it was 0. So 0 equaled 350 minus 125. Solved it out. 2 1/3 was our x, or our dependent, or our number of hours traveled. Check them out.